Most people have the same retirement plan. Work until 65. Save as much as you can. Then, maybe, if everything goes right, start living. That's not a plan. That's a gamble. And the scary part? Most people don't realize what they're actually gambling with. It's not money. There's a guy named Daniel, 48 years old, project manager in Charlotte, North Carolina. He spent the last 22 years doing everything right. Maxed out his 401k, paid off the house early, kept his expenses tight. By most measures, Daniel had won. But a couple of years ago, his dad passed away, 71 years old, retired at 66, had 5 good years. At the funeral, Daniel's uncle leaned over and said something that stuck. He said, "Your dad always talked about what he was going to do when he retired. He just never got around to doing most of it." Daniel drove home that night and stared at his retirement projections on his laptop. The numbers looked fine, but something felt very wrong. Here's the thing. Almost nobody tells you about the standard retirement math. It was never built to help you retire as early as possible. It was built to stop you from running out of money in the worst imaginable situation. There's a well-known rule most financial planners use. You probably know it, the 4% rule. The idea is simple. Save 25 times your annual spending, withdraw 4% a year, and your money should last. So, if you spend $60,000 a year, you'd need $1.5 million saved. If you spend $80,000, that's $2 million. Sounds airtight, right? Here's what most people don't know. A financial researcher named Michael Kitces went back through decades of real market data. He looked at what actually happened to retirees who followed the 4% rule through real recessions, real crashes, real economic chaos. And the results were not what anyone expected. 2/3 of those retirees, people following that same rule, ended up nearly doubling their original balance. Not spending it down, doubling it. Half of them ended up with almost 3 times what they started with. They didn't run out of money. Their money kept growing. What that tells you is this. The 4% rule isn't a target. It's a floor. It was designed to protect you in the absolute worst scenarios. Which means, for most people, it's more conservative than it needs to be. That changes the math. And when you pair that with a few other factors, it changes the entire picture of what's actually possible at 55. Now, before you say it, yes, retiring at 55 sounds like something only rich people do, or people with pensions, or people who got lucky in the market. But stick with me here, because there's a strategy most people overlook completely. It's not all or nothing. Think about Daniel again. He's not the kind of person who wants to sit on a beach for 30 years. He's sharp, he's skilled, and he actually likes solving problems. He just hates the 40-hour grind, the mandatory schedule, the Sunday dread. What if he stepped back at 55, not to stop working entirely, but to work on his own terms? Some people call this semi-retirement or phased retirement. But really, it's just building a second income layer on your own schedule. Could be a few hours of consulting a week. Could be turning a skill into a small online business. Could be rental income from a property. Could be anything that generates even a modest, reliable cash flow. Here's why that matters so much. Let's say Daniel pulls in just $2,000 a month from part-time consulting. $24,000 a year. That's money that never touches his retirement account, which means his portfolio stays untouched, which means it keeps compounding. Say he has $500,000 in his 401k at 55. At a conservative 6% annual growth, with no new deposits and no withdrawals, that $500,000 grows to roughly $895,000 in 10 years, almost $900,000, just by leaving it alone. And then, somewhere in his mid to late 60s, Social Security kicks in. Another income stream, one he's already paid into for decades. You start stacking those layers, investment income, part-time earnings, Social Security, and suddenly, the math doesn't require 30 years of full-time work anymore. It requires a plan and some patience. The people who pull this off early don't do it by earning more. They do it by thinking differently about what retirement actually is. But here's where the conversation gets more serious. And this part matters more than any spreadsheet. In 2024, Stanford researchers published something that quietly shook the world of longevity science. They found that aging doesn't happen gradually. It doesn't steadily creep up on you year by year. Instead, there are two specific points in life where the body shifts dramatically, almost like cliffs. The first one hits around age 44. The second one hits around 60. What that means in practical terms, the hike you've been putting off, the trip you've been planning, the mornings you want to have for yourself, those aren't waiting for you at 65. The window for doing those things at full capacity may actually be closing faster than you think. This isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to reframe the question. Most retirement planning is built around one question. Do I have enough money? But that's only half the question. The other half is, will I have enough time and enough health to actually use it? Because here's the quiet truth that nobody talks about at those financial planning seminars. You can rebuild a bank account. You cannot rebuild a decade. So let's bring this back to Daniel. He didn't retire at 55 because he gave up. He didn't retire because he stopped caring. He did it because he ran the numbers, the real numbers, and realized he didn't need to wait until 65. He realized the 4% rule had more flexibility than he'd been told. He realized that even modest part-time income would let his portfolio keep growing in the background. And he realized that the second biological cliff was only about 12 years away. So, he made a call. Not to quit, to shift. He kept a small consulting arrangement, enough to cover his day-to-day expenses, without touching his investments. He started hiking the Blue Ridge Parkway on Tuesday mornings. He's planning a month-long trip to Portugal with his wife next fall, something they'd been talking about since 2009. And his retirement account? Still growing. The biggest financial mistake isn't retiring too early. It's building a number for so long that you forget to ask what the number is actually for. Before you run another projection, before you update another spreadsheet, ask yourself honestly, what does the time actually look like after 65? Is it the same energy? The same health? The same freedom to move? Because the goal was never to have the most money in the room at the end. The goal was always to have enough time to live the life you actually wanted. If you want to understand how money really works, not just retirement math, but the full picture of wealth, income, and financial freedom, subscribe to Money IQ Pro. New videos every week, in plain English, no jargon. You can always earn more money. You can move to a lower cost of living city. You can pick up new skills. You can rebuild a portfolio after a down year. But the weeks you spend waiting, those don't come back. The question was never whether you can afford to retire at 55. The question is whether you can afford to keep waiting.